Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this long-form Q&A driven by supporters of the beautiful community on Patreon and questions they have submitted. Now, we're going to try to make this as exhilarating as possible and also not much more disturbing than reassuring, hopefully, in the end. First question is from Jerome. I'm curious if you still think Trump's a likely winner in 2024. Trump is necessary for primary elections and detrimental to general elections, so the saying goes. The default expectation is that Trump wins. That's to say, from the vantage point of uncertainty that we're in now, because months and months and months is a long time in politics, but from that vantage point of uncertainty, Trump victory is the single most likely outcome. Trump is mostly not a local phenomenon. He is a local expression with plenty of local particular features of a global pattern. Therefore, to assess Trump's chances of winning, you have to grasp the intersection of the Trump phenomena in the United States today and global patterns of democratic decline. So let me just be a little blunt with us, if that's okay. Any assessment of Trump's chances of winning that's made by somebody who doesn't have a good handle on global patterns of democratic decline is epistemically irrelevant. It simply has no weight. And if Trump goes on to lose dramatically or self-immolate in some kind of extravagant fashion, that fact will still remain true. And it's incredibly important that we grasp this business of that intersection, because only that way will we be able to understand challenges to democracy that occur in different parts of the Western world. Now, having grasped this intersection, we move on to a second question. Has the centrist politics, to which Trumpism is a local expression of a global blowback, self-corrected in any way? Whether self-correction was possible or not? Not really, no. Therefore, the ingredients in place for such blowback are not reduced but increased today relative to 2016. That itself doesn't settle the matter. Biden could still win, even if that's true. But it ain't a pretty aspect of where the winds are blowing. So the default position is that people who in particular want to avoid a Trump victory should see that as the default scenario and reflect accordingly. Our next question is from James, who is asking, with everything going on in the world at the moment, climate change, institutional and economic decline, it can sometimes feel like all the trends and forces in society are making things increasingly worse. I am wondering what, if anything, gives you optimism about the future in the short and long term. James, it's a bunch of letters and emails like that I received before I started any channels on YouTube that got me to begin this public conversation, because I was actually thinking that I would bring out a little bit of academic work into the world, so much delayed by my long-term illness, where I'm celebrating the 20-year anniversary of it this month, actually. But I thought, no, I shouldn't wait. I should try to make my public intellectual contribution not follow my intellectual contribution, but occur simultaneously or even come before. I am lucky because personally, optimism in personal life and optimism about politics are not terribly connected for me, unless the two come to intersect with great immediacy. That's to say, if somebody's coming to take me away in the middle of the night and put me in jail. I know that's not true of everybody, and I know that that's not anything other than a matter of sensibility. It depends on the perspective on the world around you that you start with. Is it true that our democracies are in decline and that they're going to be weaker 10 years from now than they are today? Yes. Now, does that mean there is nothing we can do about it? No. Does that mean that we can't significantly slow this decline? No, it doesn't mean that. We can significantly slow that decline. And slow it significantly enough so it even makes a difference down the line to whether a democracy lapses or sustains. So we can make a huge positive difference. That is always true, by the way. We're always living in a world that could be 1% worse or 1% better. And that in itself is an automatic point against a kind of resignation, whether it be of a deeply depressive kind or a kind of eyes glittering, glistening, self-delighted kind of resignation. Well, look at the world go to hell in a cart, but that's anyway in a kind of misanthropic fashion what human beings deserve. So, is that decline happening? Sure, it is. But at the same time, are we not living through one of the most remarkable phases in the history of human politics? That's to say, the phase of the invention of the modern democratic republic, which is one of the greatest inventions of human beings. And even if we experience democratic decline, short of abysmal democratic collapse, we'll still be living in that. I think it's an extraordinary thing that for a century and more, we can talk about having lived in something like that political structure, and we can look ahead and say that most of us probably will be living in that political structure in years, if not in decades to come. So that's an extraordinary situation of historical privilege. The reason that all of this feels ineliminably wrong to us is that we have the sense that future generations should live better than us. And we have the sense that there is progress in history, which isn't true. I mean, there is technological progress, certainly, but there is not clear evidence of political progress. There is no ethical progress, historically. Both in the sense that what we mostly call progress is just progress from our point of view, that's to say a type of change, but also in the sense that when what we recognize as progress occurs, it can be rolled back. And that's itself a very important fact. I mean, we tend to think that certain attainments are there to be built on and that we're either will move forward or we'll stay where we are. But of course, there's always the possibility of rolling back. And in fact, I come from an intellectual tradition that's more focused on the negative than on the positive. One of the thinkers I admire is Judith Shklar, and she used to think that we've got to start with injustice, not with justice, with unfreedom, right? Not with freedom. We've got to start with understanding the ways things can get radically worse. Right? We've got to be clear about how to avoid that and what that looks like and what it looks like when it's around the corner and we can still prevent it. So it's inherently hard for us because of that teleological prejudice we have, that even if we intellectually have given up on teleology, we still feel Gosh, surely it's got to be 4 steps back, but 5 steps forward. Come on, come on. And then there is something else, and that is a deep conviction that has enormous pedigree in the recent history of the West, that problems aren't real problems unless they have real solutions. And of course, one of the tragic truths about politics is that some problems have solutions, other problems have partial solutions, yet other problems have no solutions. And which is which is something that's important for us to work out. But the very idea that just because there's a very big problem, that there has to be a solution, and if only we were rational enough, and if only evil-doing folks got out of our way enough, we would get there. Well, that is an illusion. At the core of all of the sideways meandering I've just done must be the following idea, that what we want in the end is a situation whereby we can tell a story about our political world and where it's going that is at the same time capable of reconciling hope with robust truthfulness, right? We don't want a situation where the only hopeful stories we can tell are bogus, right? And we don't want a situation where the only robustly truthful stories are hopeless, right? Do I personally believe that we can tell hopeful stories about our political world going forward that are at once hopeful and intransigently truthful? I believe that. So interestingly, to that extent, I remain an optimist. Our next question is from Suzann, who's asking, with the election results in Argentina and the Netherlands, it's concerning, and even more so for Europe and the USA, if we elect leaders that wish to decrease aid to Ukraine. So I hope, feeling too wobbly because there might be a thread of pessimism in my answer. But I think we've got to insert hope too. Losing Ukraine's security is not what we lose if we lose our democracy. It's an example of what we lose if we lose our democracy. Because if we lose our democracy, then on the international stage, we're going to face many Ukraines. We're going to face huge, widening and deepening security challenges, which we are not just going to be unable to solve, but which will be ourselves fueling if we have anti-democratic governments. And we are at risk of electing people who use democracy to undermine democracy. And just like we can explore a default scenario for the 2024 election in the United States, so we can explore a default scenario cumulatively for Western democracy, let's say by 2040. And that scenario is that by 2040, 1 in 4 Western democracies might be collapsed. That's a reasonable on-par scenario. That is not some kind of extreme, implausible worst case. That is sort of center ground. We could do better, we could do worse. There is, of course, a sense in which this is not a passive process. It's actually up to us. And if we could take us invitationally, right, we realize that citizens engaging in this constructively makes a difference to where the outcome is going to lie. And so what we want is not to arrest this process altogether, because we can't do that, but to bring it about that 1 in 4 democracies by 2040, instead of collapsing, come close to collapsing but sustain. Or that only 1 in 12 democracies collapse by 2040. So If we put democratic decline on the table and we put this phenomena of folks using democracy to undermine democracy, and we connect that with Ukraine, the pessimistic conclusion is that Ukraine is just an important example of the sorts of mess losing our democracy gets us into on the international stage. And so we need to do more to get the security issues connected with Ukraine right over the months and years to come. And that's a tall ask, a tall order, I must say. But over and above that, we must avoid the much bigger crises that are on the table for us, but that we still have the power to avoid. With your permission, for health reasons, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop now, but I'm going to come back in a few hours or in a day to continue, because we've got about 15 more questions left, and we've got to say some more optimistic stuff about the world too. So I'll see you in a moment, which for me will be a bit longer than a moment. Hello, beautiful community. I hope you've got more beautiful since we last spoke, which is a couple of seconds for you, but it's 2.5 days for me, which is a long time for you to get more beautiful. Our next question is about Russia and Putin's election. But I just want to say that I'm sending my love to anybody going through difficult health stuff, and I know that can be especially hard around the festive period later on this month, next month, this month is the last day of November, next month is the last day of November today. I can still hold you when I'm in a very difficult place, physically, as in some ways I have been recently, because it's possible for me to see heaven from hell. And one day we'll talk about that too, actually. Maybe not on any of the main channels, but this business of contact not only with this world, but with heaven, right? I'm not saying anything religious here. When you are in a really screwed up situation, it's a wonderful gift, and it's a matter of luck and a matter of constitution. I needed to go through a lot of profoundly disabling illness for many years to develop that capacity of reach and access. Access is the key word here. Right? There's no way you can drift from where you will not be able to access that. But historically, there's one very important figure, Beethoven, who developed that capacity before he ran into any problems of illness. And we'll talk about that somewhere in some channel, maybe on the New Music channel at some point. Putin. Who is still alive. Johan F is asking, do you believe there is a non-trivial chance that an even slightly unfavorable result in the first round of elections could spell disaster for the regime? I'm going to give a flavor here, and that's how we're going to do the rest of the questions, actually. I'm going to finish all the questions in this session, no matter how I go physically. That's to say that if I need to, I'll give more aphoristic answers. So we'll get there today no matter what. Okay, so Putin can't have a disastrous result in the election because anybody running against Putin will be Putin. That's to say, they will be a pawn of Putin's. There'll be a functional bit of political technology used for Putin's benefit. So there is no sense in which he can lose the election. The capacity to paint fake numbers is available in sufficient quantities to the regime. I am not an expert on this, and therefore I don't know how many they can easily paint in 2024. But certainly, long before the regime was anywhere near as repressive as it is now, they could paint 15% extra easily. Now, the real answer. Russia is a kind of elective monarchy. So the election isn't real, but it still has enormous significance, right? It's a ritual of appearance that has consequences in reality. Ritual based on appearances. So what are the appearances? The appearances are appearances as academic folks talking about this call it acclimation. So the key thing for the Putin regime is that the election goes through with the perception of acclimation. That's to say, with nothing being too viscerally visible that says Putin is not the president or that Putin is not a legitimate political institution. And that's the worry for Putin. The worry for Putin is not that he's not going to win by enough percentage points. The worry is there going to be something going on that's going to interfere with the picture in a way that it'll be irresistibly available to the Russian population, and the propaganda machine won't be able to shield the population from seeing it. A month, and even more so half a year, and are long periods in the life of a regime like this. In other words, as we saw with the Prigozhin rebellion, things can change. However, there is virtually no room for meaningful political mobilization against the regime in Russia. A few years back, if you tried to mobilize, you'd just be taken off from the ballot. You'd be taken off from some kind of capacity to run for anything. Now you just go to jail straight away before you've made any impact. So there is virtually no possibility for meaningful political mobilization against the regime. It's fascinating to watch what the Russian opposition will tell voters to do. Because it's one of those situations where if you put aside the needs of the Russian opposition groups to remain relevant to Russians, and we mustn't forget that their job is to remain relevant to Russians. Their job is not to please us. Their job is to make change in Russia. But it's going to be fascinating to follow what they say, what they do, how they strategize, how they fight with each other, or get over fighting with each other about this. Because quite frankly, just looking at the situation, it's not clear that any answer to the question of whether a Russian citizen should participate in this farce is available. In other words, there's no mechanism of change which the election can convert into, as far as we can see. Therefore, just as an expert looking from the side, as an analyst or a commentator looking from the side, you can't really critique too hard someone who says to Russians, just stay at home. Because telling them, well, go and vote or draw something rude on the ballot paper, that's just as good as staying at home. As far as apparent mechanisms for transformation go, right? The Russian opposition groups can't say that. They can't accept that. They need a strategy of some kind, even if it's a strategy of yielding some kind of minor advantage that might become relevant in the future. But it's a dead end politically as far as challenging the regime goes, this election. Unless events happen very, very rapidly, that's possible. But as things stand, there is no possibility for positive action to get from A to B to C to D to create a situation that challenges the regime for any oppositional force in the country. Our next question is from Alex. Any insights on Belarus and Lukashenko's current position, particularly relating to Ukraine? Belarus was much in the news, but now less so. So I'm a big fan of Belarus being more in the news, because I don't think you grasp what's happening in that part of the world unless you include Belarus in that picture of a conflict between a modern democratic republic and something like authoritarian imperialism on the ex-Soviet space. And that's why Belarus matters for Ukraine more than Ukrainian policy and Ukrainian discourse recognizes. So, I mean, let's just make a couple of points in quick succession. There are very concerning issues about Belarus's sovereignty. Who knows exactly where Belarus's sovereignty ends and where it begins? For instance, when it comes to issues like Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. Who controls that? So it's not just that Belarus is suffering from a deficit of sovereignty, it's also suffering from a murkiness of sovereignty. And it might even be a murkiness for the political agents involved. So that's one point. Two, the Belarusian opposition faces some of the challenges that the Russian opposition faces. That's to say, how do you create a plausible sort of agent realistic, who's going to do what, how, and when, and what are going to be the consequences, picture of change domestically in Belarus. So that's a much harder thing to do than to generate international alliances. And in the face of an inability to put together a persuasive picture of change at home, it's much more natural for the Belarusian opposition to quarrel among itself. What's positive about Belarus is that we don't yet know, and this is a big difference between Belarus and Russia, we don't yet know what the 2020 protests in Belarus mean, right? And so fatalism about them is actually premature, because they represent a civic consolidation that is absent in Russia. Which is to say that if you just removed the Lukashenko regime, it's much more natural, absent any foreign influence from the Russians, for Belarus to become a democracy than it is for Russia. Right? It's a very, very big difference of civic identity and civic mobilization. Lukashenko is much more obviously somebody who's taken the country hostage than is the case with Putin. Now, of course, there's this difficult dynamic that Lukashenko has taken the country hostage while he is himself being taken hostage by a bigger external power. I think there is a sense in which Lukashenko wants power by any means. That's to say that he'd even want it if Belarus disappeared and became some kind of part of Russia. He'd want power in Russia too. a lot of people believe that Belarus could be the catalyst for a transformation that not only leads to change in Belarus, but also leads to change in Russia. Our next question's from Chuck, who's saying, Vlad, I do occasionally write to President Biden and his administration. I'm wondering which advisors are aiming him toward limited aid in order to try and get Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, and which advisors are understanding the global systemic risk involved. I read something in the Kiev Post about how Blinken's a bit more hawkish than Sullivan. I'm trying to make a difference in my communications. I'm not sure exactly who to contact and what is the more effective way to convey the need for increasing military aid. So I might not satisfy all of your questions. I'm just thinking, should I talk about differences between Blinken and Sullivan? I won't, because I think there's people well placed to talk about that. I mean, Biden himself has certainly exercised a brake at several points during the war for different reasons. One historical reason being escalation management, and in particular nuclear escalation management. Much more important than differences within the Biden administration is the fact that probably all parties across these differences do not have a clear strategic picture that goes beyond Ukraine being sovereign, democratic and free. I think these are the words Sullivan used recently. What does that mean? And why do we want that? And Ukrainians want it. Why do we want it? What do we get from that? So, I mean, here, of course, I've been a broken record for many months on the main channel and here about how we, beyond Ukrainian survival plus, as I put it, lack a strategy. And I think you think about that a lot, Chuck, because you use that expression, systemic global risk. So I think the number one point here is that there's a challenge around a lack of strategy that's far more important than any differences about a drop more support, a drop less support. The second point is that the argument that needs to be made is in terms of Western national security and catastrophically unamenable security arrangements from our Western point of view, right? So I'm contrasting that with the let's help Ukraine because they're trying to be free and the mean empire is trying to take them over. That argument has power and place, but much less power and place than it used to have a while ago. And the sort of global distribution of democratic values also has very little purchase, I think. The argument has to be in terms of Putin as a security challenge to us. The problem we always run into here, Chuck, is that for that, you've got to understand what the Kremlin are trying to do. And we have to be fair, that's a tough ask. It's a tough ask of commentators, it's a tough ask of people who are participating in the discourse. And it requires some kind of historic close attention to the Putin regime. Because if the Putin regime's aims were distinctly delimited, then all we'd have, roughly, are arguments that are to do with regional security and to do with Ukraine security, right? That'd be less of a global security emergency, if you like. And then the third point I'd make is that the key issue here is the 2024 election and the fact that, the way things are looking right this moment is how we put it right at the beginning of this conversation when we said that we don't know what will happen in the 2024 election, but the default expectation should be a Trump victory from where we stand. That's a problem for Ukraine. That's a problem for global security. And that remains so whether one is positive or very negative about the Biden administration. So that's what I'd say. And then I suppose fourth is, just to acknowledge that you are engaging in politics here and you're reaching out to political representatives, which is an expression of a kind of qualified minimal trust in the political process that helps keep our democracies less unhealthy. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for being there. Monica is asking, what would be your answer to Russia invading Finland with suspicious Iraqis, Afghans, Syrians, and Somalians? We want to close our borders. Well, Monica, I don't love the expression suspicious Iraqis, Afghans, but the politics of the Kremlin is about destabilization and always about fueling internal conflicts, internal tensions in states that are Russia's enemies. So, in Finland's case, this would be to create some tension between Russians and Finns in Finland, to create some extra food and fuel for populist forces in Finland, to maximize polarization a little bit. I mean, that's the sort of politics with which the Kremlin approaches the way it wants to mess up our democratic life. Don't forget, commitment to supporting Ukraine and all Western countries is a product of a relatively sustainable democratic existence that Putin believes is going to be short-lived, and that way he's gonna win the war. Of course, none of that analysis rules out important rights and human rights issues for the folks involved. Matt is asking, I wonder if an opportunity existed for Israel to reach out to the international community, specifically the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, for assistance in deposing Hamas. Then you have a long paragraph which you mention a possibility of a joint peacekeeping force with the explicit goal of arresting Hamas leaders and deposing Hamas. You say, I fear a brief moment that existed for benign US imperialism to effect positive change passed. Then again, domestic Israeli political realities may have made such an idea impossible. I'll be very, very brief. I think you're right, basically, that a consensus of a sufficient order formed in Israel about deposing Hamas, whatever that means, and whatever strategy or lack of strategy might be there to back that up. The Biden administration and Biden himself would have wanted to do more to affect Israel's response than they felt they could do. That's an expression of imperial weakness. Now, I call the US an empire, and it's a reasonable debate. Not really a debate about what the US is, but a debate about how to constructively use that term, empire, whether the US is an empire or not. I call the US an empire, and I say that there are certain global problems that can't be resolved without the projection of imperial power, such that you either get a world without empire, in which you have no capacity to even address these problems, or you get a world with empire, and you can sometimes address these problems, therefore. No empire will ever be benign, but some empires will have considerable possibility for benign action, the way, for instance, the Russian Empire does not. If the Biden administration could have affected the situation more, as they wish they had, that would have been to slow Israel down, to make sure that what Israel does is more targeted, to make sure that the gap between the Hamas terror attack of the 7th of October and Israel's response is sufficiently large, right? Not to create a collapse of global sympathy and empathy for Israel as a consequence of Israel's response. But I don't think what the Biden administration would have wanted there would be a regime change war in Gaza. Biden has a feeling, right, about the deleterious consequences of exercises in the destruction of political leadership, political institutions in parts of the world without a strategy for what comes next. So I think yes to the Biden administration wanting more influence, no to them wanting regime change in Gaza if they had that influence. So the real point here is that the suggestion you're putting on the table doesn't really get us that far unless it begins to tie itself, right, to a fundamental picture of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? How do we begin to get to a two-state solution, right? And is Israel's response going to take us closer or further away from that, right? That would be what a benign and powerful projection of U.S. power could have done. Our next question is from Chris, and you're saying, in the U.S., we're of course facing a severe threat to our democracy, and a subject that comes up very frequently as an obstacle to preserving our democracy is money in politics, which has been a growing problem in the US since Citizens United. I've heard this concern not just from the left but also from the right. And you talk about the Israeli lobby. So if that's okay, let me just take it briefly and broadly and focus on this issue of money in politics and money being speech, not power. Analytically, the idea that money is speech but not power is completely unavailable, right? What view of human beings, what view of their psychology, of their rationality, of their motivation would you need to take to conceive of a world in which money is not power? So we have got a very profound corrupting element here if we don't recognize properly that money is power, which allows powerful groups to bring about policies, bring about regulatory environments that harm those who are less powerful. The problem with what I've said, however, is a seminar point, right? The question isn't, is what I've said right? The question is, how do you bring it about that what I've said comes to have sufficient political purchase, right? To actually bring about change? That's a much harder question. Our next question is from Rachel, and Rachel is asking, what's the strangest thing you've ever consumed, and did you end up enjoying it? I'm not sure I consumed anything utterly extraordinary. I've probably had dog in Tonga served as though it were pig, because pigs are precious and the country's full of homeless dogs that often end up in feasts because local folks don't wanna or can't afford a pig. So I think I don't think I have anything bewilderingly more exciting than that. Joanna is asking, question about democracy. In Switzerland, we have direct democracy and we vote regularly about basically everything. If one is not a specialist in the subject concerned, one often ends up voting emotionally. Would it not be better to skip the vote if you're not an expert in a certain subject? Or is it better to always vote? Because if we don't, we risk the decline of our democracy. The quick cartoonish answer is that obviously, putting aside the issue of how far you can give an individual advice without knowing them, right? But apart from that, yes, you want people to participate in politics, whether they're experts or not, although citizens knowing more and not being in their own fact bubble is, of course, important. So the way you preserve democracy is not by having citizen experts, but by having enough pluralism of institutions such that it's possible to counteract majoritarian nuttiness whenever it occurs. Our next question is from Miho, and you've written a lovely micro essay, also mentioning Plato's Symposium, about which we might talk one day on the Philosophy Channel. So I'm going to give a condensed version. We seem to be moving away from appreciating the aesthetics of governance, the elegance, fairness, and justice, and well-crafted laws and systems, and leaning more toward the utilitarian, results-driven approach. This trend echoes in various sectors, including my own experience in academia. As someone deeply involved in basic scientific research, particularly development of the human brain, I've noticed a similar shift. The passion and curiosity that fuel basic science are often sidelined by a growing insistence on direct, tangible applications. Relevance is that poisonous word in this realm. Research should be relevant. The arts should be relevant. Classical music should be relevant. It's becoming increasingly challenging to secure funding for research driven by the quest for knowledge as opposed to research with immediate practical applications. As we prioritize the applied aspects over the aesthetic and the ethical, there's a risk of losing touch with the fundamental values and principles that form the bedrock of a fair and just society. Well, let me just say a couple of things, because I think we would be here for 4 hours if we really did justice to what you're asking. So let me just say 2 things then. One about scientific research and one about politics. A lot of scientific research is best done when there isn't a clear enough idea of what social benefit it is going to generate. I think that's a very, very important idea. And in a healthy society, there is institutional room for sustainable practice of that idea. In politics, there is a risk, and this is the second point, of a kind of managerial psychology that makes you feel that you're engaged in a kind of a reasonable way of going on that takes you beyond conflicts of value, and therefore being prudent and managerially adequate can solve the basic problems of politics if you are effective enough in doing that properly. And that's a big risk that a lot of centrist administrations have to answer to, whether that is Blairism in the UK or much of what the Democrat Party in the United States has offered in recent years, whether it's Macron in France. And the problem there is that you're not transcending value conflicts or resolving them, you're repressing them. And now we have a whole bunch of centrist governments across the West, which we have thought of as the political mainstream, that have systematically repressed value concerns that large numbers of citizens, large minorities, sometimes even small majorities of citizens feel and have. And they've not only repressed that, they've also repressed their own capacity to understand that that is what they've done. And that is why if you look at, for instance, the political discourse, I mean, obviously this is an extreme example of Hillary Clinton recently. Now, I do think that there's a lot of biographical trauma with Hillary that explains stuff she says. But putting that aside for a moment, Hillary's speech, generally her political speech, is an extraordinary manifestation of an incapacity to understand how the things that she fears most in politics are in part generated by a politics and a way of thinking about politics that has been her way of doing politics, her way of thinking about politics for several decades. That's to say, how has mainstream politics produced this crazy situation we face, where we've got a wave of political forces which are trying to use democracy to undermine democracy. We're not just victims of that. If we're the political mainstream, we have to understand what we've done to bring this about too. Our next question is from Jay. And Jay is asking, I had some thoughts on your recent video about Israel-Palestine. I think your point about the distinction of not trying to kill civilians versus trying to not kill civilians is an important one. My question, how should our inference of intention to avoid civilian casualties be adjusted for when an actor to a conflict actively pursues obfuscation and intermingling of their operatives and military installations with civilian life? How should states balance their policy between ensuring the safety of their own citizens against the safety of civilian life of another state, when an opponent intentionally shifts this balance toward maximizing civilian suffering via the co-location of folks? I don't mean for this to be a leading question and imply a blank check for atrocities. Okay. So when we generally think about civilian casualties, we've got to balance ethical and political considerations. That's my assessment. It's controversial, but it's my recommendation as a political philosopher, which is to say, the ethical assessment basically says this. Attribute the same worth to the civilians of your enemy as you attribute to your own civilians. It's very difficult to get out of this ethically, not because there is some theory that tells us about this, but because the most basic ethical consideration in the modern world is that all human beings have equal moral worth. But then politics comes in. And the basic organs of legitimacy in politics are nation states. That's where governments are held accountable. So they're obviously going to be in a special relation with their subjects, with their citizens. So as much as that ethical principle is compelling, it's not real politically. So what you ask, therefore, in politics isn't for that principle to be applied, but for that principle to float at a distance that isn't too far from policy. It doesn't need to be immediately what policy becomes, but it shouldn't be at too great a distance from policy. That's to say that policy can be at some distance from the idea that you value the enemy's citizens just like you would if they were your own citizens. But you can't do that, but you shouldn't drift too terrifyingly far from doing that, right? If you're in the realm of 1,000 to 1, you are far, far, far beyond anything that any philosophically minded public intellectual, let's say, could possibly approve of, if the intellectual is worth their salt at all. So how does this change, right, this balance that we've just put on the table, if the other side exploits their civilians, puts them in danger, right, and creates artificial intermingling to protect their military assets, their military personnel? You know, and we know that that happens in many conflicts. How does it change that balance? It doesn't change it at all. That's because you are not liberated out of your responsibilities by the bad conduct of your enemy, right? The fact that Russia does terrible things in Ukraine doesn't liberate Ukraine into attacking Russian civilians. Now, Ukraine would attack Russian civilians if it could, and if it were beneficial to it. And if it did do that in sufficient numbers, and it's something we might see in 2024, actually, mass casualty events on Russian territory. Part of our story of the war coming onto Russian soil. But if we saw that, perhaps we could talk about whether it's sort of inevitable and necessary, but we could certainly not argue it's just, right? We could just say it's an issue we shouldn't over-ethicize because it's part of a kind of existential war for survival and so on. So it's necessary or not necessary more than it is just or unjust. But basically, no, Israel does not get special leeway, right, to create significantly greater distance between what it does in Gaza and what it would do if these were Israeli civilians involved, in virtue of the intermingling. So the answer is it doesn't change the situation at all. Whatever picture of responsibility to protect civilian life on the other side you start with, you stay with that very same picture, whether the enemy intermingles or not, right? You might say, well, what do you do then if you're fighting an existential war? Or at least if you're trying to save vast numbers of your own citizens. Well, what happens then is that your actions really come into the realm of necessity, right? They don't come into the realm of whether it's ethical or not. It's never going to be ethical. You could, at a stretch, argue that it's necessary. The way you couldn't argue, right? There's no way to argue that the civilian casualties in Gaza are necessary, right? Again, speaking of public intellectuals worth their salt, nobody could tell you that what we've seen is a matter of military or political necessity. Our next question is from Benjamin. He's saying, could you update us on strategic essentialism? Well, I don't want to say anything about the writings of Spivak, but maybe I'll make a comment about how the concept floats in our contemporary practice, and it certainly suffers a considerable degree of concept creep too. Very cartoonishly, it's the idea that you, in principle, reject a certain kind of essentialism about your group, let's say, but that you adopt it in practice for the attainment of certain benign political ends like social justice and inclusion, liberation. So you downplay the complexity and difference within your group, or indeed within any group that has to be there within any group, for the benefit of certain political outcomes. Now, in practice, let me just tell you what could go wrong with that in practice as a way of saying more about the concept. One thing that could go wrong in practice is, of course, that strategic essentialism becomes real essentialism. And we are seeing quite a bit of that, actually, in contemporary Western hyper-identity politics, that you start with a political practice that consciously denies a theoretical commitment while going on as though that commitment were true, and eventually lands you in a place where nobody remembers that the theoretical commitment ain't true. So strategic essentialism can become a belief in real essentialism in practice. That's one risk. Another risk is that it goes in the other direction, that you might be doing strategic essentialism in a place where there's actually room for real essentialism, right? Let's take an example of feminism. Various arguments about injustice and prejudice in the relations of men and women, right? What if you thought, as I do, that discrimination against women has certain essentialist features to it? That's to say, it's not a product of social conditions only, but it's also a product of human psychology, right? It's a product, among other things, of a male intolerance for feminine aspects. Right, so men's incapacity to bear feminine aspects of themselves is a universal feature of male psychology. It can get particularly expressed or exacerbated under certain cultural circumstances. Well, I've just made an essentialist point. An essentialist point that directs us to a universal psychology, untranscendable by social practice. It can be filtered by social practice. It can be brought out less or more by social practice, but it's untranscendable by social practice. It sits above a biology, right? Who has that psychology? Men, biological men. So there's plenty of essentialist stuff to say. In other words, here I've just rejected a key tenet of much feminist discourse, which says that discrimination against women and men being, not able to recognize women for their full capacities is a product of late capitalism, a product of certain social conditions, and so on. So there is also, of course, a risk. It's irrelevant if you don't recognize the example I've given, you don't agree with it. The point is, there are often essentialist points to make that are true. And another risk factor with strategic essentialism is that it may be the case that it's just imprudent to and parasitic upon a level of solidarity necessary to achieve political goals, to postulate essentialist features of a group when they aren't really true. That might not be, in most cases, a politically constructive practice. It could be in some cases constructive, but it could be unconstructive in most cases. So the point of these risk factors is really just to illuminate a little bit more the concept and its possible uses and misuses. Our next question is from Corkwick, and you are saying, I just watched your video. Thank you for giving me information regarding my moral compass. When you talked about Ukraine possibly operating differently with respect to non-combatants, given a different situation. So here I must have talked about Ukraine attacking Russian civilians. If that wasn't very bad for Ukraine because it would not impress its Western allies. That if there weren't various factors stopping Ukraine from doing that, it would do that if it felt it served it, either in the purposes of winning the war against its invader, or for purposes of keeping the show on the road, right? I mean, so far, arguably the central reason for the Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian towns, for example, Moscow, has been to please Ukraine's domestic audience, right? Not to achieve any strategic military targets. But I'm certainly saying that under different circumstances, Ukraine would choose to attack Russian civilians more. And indeed, in 2024, we may well be looking at mass casualty events on Russian territory and the war coming onto Russian soil much more. And you're saying, I asked myself what people who are feeling humiliated for long periods of time would think about the combatant-non-combatant differentiation. How does the psychology of this special situation change the view of people? I think in a way, we're going to have to talk about this for a very long time or not at all. I think some of what we've said has already tugged on a few threads that your question raises. Let me just prophylactically say two opposite things. Certain environments are going to be expressions of the principle that disadvantaged and downtrodden human beings often do not behave well and do not see the world objectively. And that includes not seeing their own good, their own benefit objectively. And therefore we recognize that certain ideologies of radicalization, certain ideologies of seeing violence as an end in itself, grow more propitiously in contexts that have a level of hopelessness to them, a level of despair. At the same time, prophylactically, I want to pull you in the opposite direction too, and say that you cannot take this thought with an excess of overdetermination, because it is certainly possible for radically disadvantaged folks not to be radicalized in that way, and it's absolutely possible for folks who are relatively comfortable to be radicalized. So what we don't want to do, right, is give an excessively economically overdetermined, for example, picture of the formation of radical ideologies, right? You can have somebody being radicalized into nihilistic violence if they're living next door to me too. That is entirely possible as well. Our next question is from Christopher. Relative time works. Greetings, Vlad. Such an avalanche of online content. What sources do you consider reputable and reliable? It reminds me that I'm still owing the community actually a video on this. Even the unreliable ones have their value if only to demonstrate that what people are exposed to. So I'm going to give different answers depending on the day, unless I try to give a cumulative answer. So militarily, really good source is, I think a lot of you follow Perun, but militarily, a good source of YouTube is, and Anders Pack Nielsen is very beautiful as well, is War on the Rocks, which includes a whole bunch of content. They have an app. I think a lot of you follow them anyway. And one of the formats they have there is Michael Kaufman's Russia Contingency. As far as facts go, Bellingcat is always not a bad place to start, and Elliot Higgins. As far as analysis of Russian society goes, well, we have a certain kind of an impoverishment of that because folks are struggling to do any on-the-ground work there, understandably. But there's plenty of people who you can follow. Jeremy Morris is very, very strong. I've recently recommended several videos with Jade McGlynn. I think Jade is really, really, really good. She's one of the best people. Sam Green is very, very good. You also know that I like Mark Galeotti very, very much for several qualities he has, including his capacity to speculate responsibly. There are people who are good around the bigger, more ideological conversations, like Marlène Laruelle, for example. But I do promise I'll give that video at some point. So, but that's just at top of my head, arbitrary couple of names. Luka is saying, "Hi Vlad." Hi Luka. What is necessary to fix a lack of universities as centers of professional thought and discourse? I am 32 years old, resourceful and motivated. Is it possible to become a philosopher or thinker as an example to others? And if that's too high an ambition, how can a writer make their writing process and analysis more professional? What books or schools of thought you'd recommend? So I'm at risk of missing, I think, some parts of what you may be after, but I think that one way to begin to fix the universities is to ensure that they are spaces where free speech is available. That's not quite true at the moment. And that there are spaces where the bureaucracies stay out of politics, which actually allows the universities to have a much more powerful but legitimate political role, whereby academics down the corridor can take political positions, including in public, right? But it's an absolute nightmare for me. It's a terror to me if an academic department or the president of a university or some important bit of the university bureaucracy takes a political position that is my political position. That is just as terrifying to me as if it took an opposite position to my political position. So bureaucracies have got to stay out of politics, and the idea that they can't do that is bullshit. We've got to get into the details about why it's bullshit. I won't do that now, but it's bullshit. But of course, we've got this big picture understanding we've got to have, and that is that you do not have democracies without the institution of expertise in a healthy form. So universities, just like courts and parliaments, are central to us keeping our democracies. Now, you're asking about how to think better. How to professionalize thought. Well, if you're talking about something like philosophical thought, then the way you professionalize it is something that is absolutely, on good days, encouraged in an academic institution, but it's not conceptually confined to it, which is to say, the central way you professionalize philosophical thought is by instilling wherewithal, right? So what's the difference really between Ricky and Suzann discussing a philosophical issue down the pub and Quentin Skinner and Charles Taylor discussing it? Some academics with important oversight over that over that philosophical issue. The difference is wherewithal. Namely, if Ricky and Suzann down the pub say, yeah, man, I think that's what justice is all about, the problem they're going to have is that they will not know the palette of options they're choosing from. Just like an amateur football player will not know the palette of options they're choosing from when they're striking a ball. Just like an amateur piano player will be choosing from 6 instead of 776 options about how to distribute the weight of a finger at the keyboard. And so even if you choose best out of these 7 options, you're not going to get the answer right, because you don't know what you're choosing from. And so in that way, Suzann and Ricky down the pub will simply not know what options there are about what to say about justice, simply because they will not have an understanding of every important human contribution to this conversation across the history of the West, or indeed the history of other cultures. And what will be an important feature of that conversation down the pub is that if either Suzann or Ricky say something genuinely original and interesting, they will not have the skills to recognize that the other one or they themselves have done that, right? So the professionalization of thought is to begin with about wherewithal. It's not about getting it right, it's about having a rough understanding of what it is that you are choosing from, right? And then what's interesting is that the professional mind can make the wrong choice too, right? You can know that there are 766 things to choose from, but you can go on and make the wrong choice. But your professionalism will be revealed not in you being right, but in you having that consciousness, that self-consciousness, that you know where to look for all of the baskets from which you might begin lifting things up. You're not just confined to seeing 2 baskets when there are many. That's one thing to say about the process of the professionalization of thought. And therefore, could Ricky and Suzann achieve that in principle outside of an academic department? Yeah, of course, without any doubt. But there are risk factors involved with that too. Jeannie's asking whether I saw Benjamin Tallis's chat on Silicon Curtain the other day. No, I didn't, but I got a brief glimpse of it out of curiosity because you asked me. So I just watched it for a few minutes. And you found it interesting in terms of conversations about the global prospect of democracy and how we face down the challenge of authoritarian regimes, and you're wondering what I thought about it. So I don't want to pick on a 10-15 minute snippet of somebody's presentation of their views. That could often not be fair. So I'll just say two things in abstraction, if that's okay. One is, I do not believe that our own domestic problems at home are soluble in the first, second, third, or fourth, or fifth instance by kind of a moral regalvanization. So we've discussed this before on several occasions, actually. So if we turn on X or Twitter, whatever it's called now, and we read all of the let's be tough on Putin voices, they're often gonna, the best of them don't think that actually, but they're often gonna give the impression that what we're really missing is a kind of a moral galvanization that Ukraine's valiant struggle against the Russian invaders can inspire us into. And the answer is no. Our democratic problems are too systemic for that to register much of a difference. Moral galvanization is not in the top 5 solutions to our democratic challenge. It would be a solution if we were just suffering from a kind of a moral fatigue or moral failure. So that's one thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that I do actually think that if we asked questions about legitimacy in the modern world, what states are minimally legitimate, very, very minimally liberal democratic answers might begin appearing. That's to say, it's not possible to imagine a legitimate state in which you have no independent courts at all. It's not possible to imagine a legitimate regime in which you can't vote out the government at all. So there is some overlap, actually, between liberal democratic institutions with very small L's and D's and basic requirements of legitimacy in the modern world. Mr. Putin's regime is not legitimate. The Chinese regime is not legitimate. Now, legitimacy can be thought of as something closer to an either-or thing or to an incremental thing. You could be more or less legitimate. So we don't want to say about a regime necessarily that we call illegitimate, there is nothing legitimate about it. But we might want to say that calling it illegitimate or legitimate is on balance the right thing to do. I don't want to legislate more deeply on these issues, but they're absolutely essential. They go to the core of how we understand basic politics in the modern world. Having said all of this, I do not believe in the global spread of democracy. I do not believe that is a central mission for Western states that we can justify or that we can pursue without doing a lot of harm to ourselves. So it doesn't follow from this minimal description of legitimacy in the modern world that doesn't indeed feature certain aspects of the modern democratic republic. It doesn't follow from that an ideology is legitimated about spreadness all over the world. It doesn't follow that is a constructive thing for us to try to do. But at the same time, we do have to fight for democracy. But fighting for democracy does not mean being in the game of the globalization, species-wide globalization of a single political system. Our next question's from Izzy Waka, and it is: really appreciate your recent chats on current affairs. Would you be open to discussing and sharing your thoughts on media bias and framing on the Israel-Hamas war? And I appreciate you go on to say quite a bit and give a few examples. I might confine myself to a few general observations. Let's see what they are. First, the vast majority of accounts and content creators we see, taken in the loosest sense, that's to say just stuff coming at us on Twitter, are not in the business of trying to be balanced. Now, don't forget, balance is not 50-50. Balance is trying to figure out on any given issue whether it is 50-50 or 90-10 or 60-40 or 100-0. So balance is not equalization, right? If I bonk you over the head unprovoked, right? Balance is not saying it's a 50-50 situation. No. Balance is saying that Vlad is misbehaving very badly. Now, first, we are exposed mostly to content creators, to accounts that are not trying to be balanced. That's to say 95, 98, if not 100% of their content is on one side of the issue. That's to say that there will be, for instance, extraordinary emphasis on the suffering of people in Gaza, but no mention of October 7th. Or there'll be emphasis on October 7th and no mention of the insupportable suffering of people in Gaza. And the problem is that even if a single tweet from an account like that is in itself correct, that tweet is delegitimated if the next 100 tweets, right, do not give any indication of an attempt at balance and therefore at an attempt at truthfulness and therefore at an attempt at being not just sincere but also accurate. And most of what we're exposed to is like that. And that's a very terribly unhealthy environment in which to be. And you've got to watch out for it. And that includes watching out for people pumping at you stuff that you like, right? I mean, the pattern to watch out for with content creators you follow is that over time they begin to give you more of what you like. The first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is that it's very important for journalistic institutions to not be afraid. That's very difficult when it comes to facts. And that's very difficult because a lot of journalistic institutions are playing a defensive game. They're contracting. They're under attack often. If they're a public broadcaster, if they're trying to serve a diverse audience, it's a nightmare for them. And so they play a kind of defensive game where we don't want to create a situation where we're going to be pushed further into a corner, where our future will be more existentially in doubt. And so there's a kind of a precarity that makes people be conservative about certain factual assertions if large numbers of viewers or readers will find them extraordinary, even if they're true. But what I want to say is down the line, that tactic of factual avoidance as a self-preservation technique does not work. It might save your neck for the week, for the month, for the year. It ain't going to save your neck over the decade. So it's very important for journalistic institutions to be very factually courageous. And it's really, really hard. Let's take an example on a separate topic. The BBC in the UK, right? One of the recent prime ministers was Boris Johnson. How do you balance this if you are the public broadcaster? Because Boris Johnson is a post-truth politician. So he generates lies at a very rapid pace, probably at a less rapid pace than Donald Trump, but at a very rapid pace. So can you say the Prime Minister has lied again for the 37th time this week? That That's a scary thing for the BBC to say. It's easy to say the Prime Minister's made an argument and then somebody's made an argument about why his argument might not be so good. And that's less scary to say than the Prime Minister lies. Because the Prime Minister has a lot of supporters and you're a public broadcaster and you're meant to serve the whole country. Very difficult balances. Of course, the same applies with Israel-Palestine. If you're not serving a very mixed audience, if you're serving an audience that you know is likely to tilt one way or another on this issue, it's very scary for you to stand by facts that your readers are not going to like and so on. So that's second thing I'd say, and I'm probably going to stop at this point. Our next question's from Phillip, and you're saying, I'm a long-time listener and fan, I'm wondering if your latest posts regarding competence and innocence are part of a more formal ethical logic system, an algebra of conflict, so to speak. I wish you health and peace your way too. I have a particular interest in pragmatics in the philosophical sense, so how people accomplish things with language. Let me say a couple of things indirectly, and I'm not sure how satisfactory they're going to be. Nothing I ever say is part of any kind of system or ethical theory, because I do not think that ethical theories are available. I think certain attempts at ethical theory are more plausible than others in my view, and the single most plausible one in my view is Aristotle's, even though it fails in my opinion. Now, why do I think that? There are many reasons why I think that. One is the incommensurability of values. That's to say the following, that throughout the history of the West, there's been a tendency to think one of two things. Either you think that all values are compatible if only we understood them properly. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau might tell us, look, if you have a situation where equality and freedom seem to conflict to you, that's only because you haven't understood the situation properly. If only you understood it properly, you'd see that there could never be a conflict between these two values. Karl Marx might tell us that quite certainly conflicts of values arise, but a certain mode of historical transformation could bring about a world in which that is no longer true, even if it has to be true, contrary to Jean-Jacques Rousseau in our world, Marx. Now, others come along and say, no, values conflict, and the conflict is real, but there are possibilities for objectively, universally arbitrating such conflict, right? So an example of that might be certain utilitarian theories that say, yeah, values clash, but there can be a way of arbitrating these conflicts at a general level by appealing to some higher value, such as utility. Now, a good question for utilitarians is if they can actually coherently say that there is any value in the world except utility. That's a separate conversation. Kantian moral theorists might come along and say, absolutely, values conflict, but we can ascertain and prescribe higher theories of rights and justice that transcend these conflicts and so on. So there is a story about values being compatible, and then there is a story about values, even if they're incompatible, being commensurable. Right? And I think both of these stories are fundamental misunderstandings of ethical life. I reject them. And that alone constitutively eliminates the theorization of ethical life as a possibility. At the level of the second thing you put on the table, let me just make a couple of remarks. Which may or may not be helpful. Reflection on practice is part of practice. That's important. what it makes to say in politics philosophically just is what it makes sense to say in politics politically. Reason in of itself does not motivate, right? Just because you should do something does not mean that under ideal social conditions even you're going to be motivated to do that, right? A good argument is as persuasive as arguments go, no more, right? A good argument is better than a bad argument as far as arguments go. But it's not necessarily more persuasive than something that isn't an argument. So that's to say that reason does not have social power. You might be right, but you might still lose because I'm bigger than you, you know? So that's 2 cents. Our last question is from E. How do you think about the dangers and the positive aspects of influencing people? Let me just say a couple of things briefly. And then we'll wrap up. A basic psychological fact about most people most of the time is that we tend to be able to estimate, and we often are pretty good at it, the impact of others on us. Often we can miss it, but we have a vaguely decent capacity to understand the impact of others on us. But we often dramatically underestimate the impact we have on others. And obviously, just being confident and secure gives one a better possibility to be objective about the impact you have on others, as well as the impact others have on you. That's one point. At the level of influencing people, I obviously have a lot of filters, and there's a lot of procedural things I approach with a pair of pliers because I am so intentional about what I put into your body. It gives me no satisfaction if you've changed your opinion about something because of me, actually, because I'm always looking for enriching your experience or adding something to you that is much deeper than a change of opinion. So I'm not a political YouTube channel that sits at the end of the month and reads letters and says, well, Ricky, Bobby, Suzann and Joe are saying they've changed their mind about, even if it's something that I'm very strongly recommending as an opinion, it gives me very little satisfaction. If you suddenly write to me and you say, well, I didn't used to think it, now I think it. I didn't used to think that, we needed to support Ukraine, now I do. It gives me no satisfaction at all. That's not what I'm trying to do. If you tell me that you feel enriched at the level of how you come to having an opinion, rather than the particular opinion you have, well, that is gratifying for me. But even here, there are very many qualifiers. And that's that, I'm not sitting here overestimating how much leverage I have over you. The public intellectual enterprise is not an enterprise where you sit down people and you give them a 7-course meal and you tell them which wines they should drink and you tell them how they should dress and you control the environment in which they sit. A public intellectual enterprise is caring very deeply what you put into people's tummies, but also being very lucid to the reality that some people are going to sit there, they're going to have a request for a 7-course meal. Other people are going to come in, they're going to get a takeaway sandwich from you, they're going to go away. And you have to not romanticize the relationship, right? And think that it's modelable on an academic enterprise, where if you write something academic, you genuinely can expect everybody to go through the 7 steps you want. They're going to have the 7 courses in the right order. They're going to have the wine you ask, and then they're going to react by saying, good meal, terrible meal, here's what I think. That's not how it works. So it's very important, and this is what love is all about for me. Love is about the fact that I don't control how you receive what I give, but I'm still going to turn up and I'm still going to hold you, right? On that note, let's love talk soon.